real intentional about when we began the work 2 weeks ago around the idea of creating a fully online summit for teachers across the state of Minnesota was we wanted to make sure that accessibility was addressed, because that's a need for our students that is a real need, and that in times of crisis is one of the things that we might try to let go. But if we're going to have kids be connected, we need to take that into consideration. The other important area is in our work around equity and making sure that we are thinking of all of the students and doing our very best work for all of the students in order to connect them. And that this emergency really lays to bear some of the most particular spots of inequity in our school systems. And so 2 goals for our summit was to make sure to have those 2 topics addressed. And I am just thrilled to be here with Jeff and the panel of presenters that are going to share with you some very, very essential and important information for us to consider as we do this work. And the last thing I'll say about it is that our intention with this summit is to bring to light practices and work that we will carry forward beyond this emergency. And so the purpose of this session is to put us in a mindset, to remind us to keep the tension on our need to do better for all students. So with that, I'm going to turn it over. I will be paying attention to the chat, and I will surface questions as they come through in order to make sure that the panelists have some, or you're able to get in touch with the panelists.
Thank you so much, Sean, for that great introduction. Hi, everybody. My name is Jeff Plum, and I'm the Online and Digital Learning Specialist at the Minnesota Department of Education. And I'm really humbled and fortunate enough to be in the position today to bring this panel conversation to light. This is something that we've been working on every single day, like we consider equity in all of our work. And it's something that keeps me up at night as I think about the outcomes for our different student populations. So I'm going to kick it over to our presenters after I talk about our norms. So I'd like everybody right now, if you haven't already done so, find the chat button in your Zoom room and practice using chat. If you don't mind going ahead and saying hello, tell us where you're joining from, and tell us in one word how you're feeling during distance learning until now. So the feelings are real. Many of the feelings are big, and we want to hear from you by way of introduction. Today's Zoom session, if you've joined other sessions from the Distance Learning Summit, is going to feel a little bit different. This is set up as a webinar. And we did that intentionally so that we could have the Q&A question as well, because we have a panel of presenters and not just one. We thought it would run a little bit easier. So, you know, your mics will be muted. If at some point there's opportunity for interaction, you can indicate, you know, with a hand raise that you want to do that. And the moderator will monitor the chat. I will also monitor the chat and try to get to your questions. You have 2 ways to put in questions. You can put them in chat, but we've also got this nifty Q&A panel. So when you put a question in the Q&A panel, we can address it in progress and or talk about it in our session. And we can sort of monitor which ones have been answered and which ones have not. We also want to let you know that we will not have enough time to finish this entire session in the Zoom. We are fully anticipating to head over to the Google Meet space because we want this to be a conversation. So the first part is going to be more of a framing and a presentation, and toward the end of this hour, we will be getting into some specific actions that teachers can take in their distance learning classrooms and the way they design their courses and the way that they deliver instruction. But much of that conversation is going to take place afterwards in our Google Meet. So please make sure that you pay attention to that link when it comes out from the moderators into chat, because that is how you will get to Google Meet and find us there. Lastly, there's a chance for you to respond by video on Flipgrid in an asynchronous way, and that link will also be coming your way. So without further ado, welcome everybody. I love to see all the names and places where people are coming from being dropped into chat and all the feelings. You know, some people are feeling good. I saw someone feeling useless. I mean, there are all kinds of feelings that we're feeling here, right? So thank you for being here today. And I want to invite in my colleague at the Department of Education and, you know, a person that I really learn a ton from. Makari Trainum is going to join and take over this first part about examining perspectives on access to distance learning. So Makari, make sure you unmute yourself and take it away.
All right. Good morning, everyone, or afternoon. It's start to lose track of time a little bit. So I'm so glad that you guys are here and joining us today and really taking an interest. I too am seeing what's going in the chat rooms, and it's very exciting to see everyone joining us from far away and near to really have a conversation and to work together in building capacity. Go ahead and go to the next slide, Jeff. I want to take us back to the original slide that we had with the picture that says we're not all in the same boat, we're all in the same storm. And I think it's fair for us to recognize that right now there's a ton of feelings that's out there for what's going on and what's coming up for us. But it's important for us to understand that although we're all living through the same pandemic right now, right? We're all recognizing that there is a virus that can be fatal to many people, that we're all in this in the sense of living through it, but the way by which we are living through it is very differently. And how we understand that, how we even see this picture in knowing that there's a pandemic, and yet even in this, the way that people are experiencing it is very different, is really important to understanding how we see and understand the work that we're going to be doing, the work that we should be doing, and how we can address inequities. It also has to bear upon us to recognize that it doesn't negate what was happening before the pandemic, that inequities did exist prior to the pandemic, and yet they are they've been illuminated to us in a very different way, because for some of us, we are engaged in things that we may not have been engaged with before, and we're probably seeing things that we may not have been able to see before. And so I want to acknowledge that we are across the board in how we're feeling, and yet the impact for people is very different as they're living their day-to-day lives. Next slide. These are some of the different headlines that have hit in front of our faces, whether we are watching the news daily, whether we are on our social media feeds. Regardless of where we're at, we are getting inundated with updates and new information, statistics about what's happening and what's going on. And within 7 weeks, it might be feeling a little bit overwhelming. I would offer that many of us are feeling a combination of overload, anxiety, potentially depression. I did see someone write useless, someone that's like, ooh, help. There's a lot of frustrations that's happening as a result of the pandemic. And the changes that we've experienced as a result of the pandemic. They're new and they are unprecedented. At the same time, there's other people, which has to be acknowledged, who are making lemonade out of lemons, right? What do I do with this? How do I turn what feels horrible into something that might be really helpful? And so we have both of these um, positions taking place. And at the same time, we have to recognize whether you're able to find the positive and find ways to be constructive in this, or whether it's a real struggle. It is a change for all of us. It's a change in the routine. It's the change in our behaviors. It's a change in the rituals and practices that we have been part of and we've been doing. And we still have to figure out, how do we respond in a way that is still going after groups of students and families that have experienced inequities over the course of this prior to the pandemic even taking place. As we are trying to be creative in what we're doing, we're kind of coining this as the new normal. And the real question is, as we think about and want to have this idea of normal come back into place, we have to be really careful about what part of normal are we trying to get back to. And I say that because for many of us in living our day-to-day lives, the busyness of getting up in the morning and whether we have to get young people ready to get off to school or whether we're rushing to the first meeting, all of those things were happening prior to the pandemic that caused for some of us to be blind to or not notice the various inequities that were taking place for students and families across the country. It's more likely that we are paying attention to them because we might actually be impacted in the way that families prior to the pandemic was impacted. And meaning that for some folks, job loss is a real thing. Furlough days is a real thing. Reducing pay is a real thing. Being able to have access to certain resources and materials is a real thing. And it's things that we may not have paid attention to before, that we might have been less empathetic or sympathetic to before. And now that we might be part of the group that is experiencing these things, we are more likely to say, wow, I can see what the impact is. And so we have to be mindful of this idea of getting back to normal, because if we push really hard to get back to normal, it means those people who were blind, that we were blind to, or that we weren't seeing before, we go right back to that mentality and that way of being by which they become blind to us again. We're not paying attention to, we don't see. And so how do we use this as an opportunity to really dig into what does equity mean and how do we really push forward? Next slide. As we are in this new time, we're noticing that connecting with folks has looked very different. Virtual dance parties are a real thing. Zoom bombing is a real thing, right? Things that we never really paid attention to before is happening now. Things that we never would have watched before. Tiger King is some big trending thing that I haven't watched, but lots of people have. And those are things that we may not have paid attention to before that we are paying attention to now. In addition to that, we're even looking at how cultural institutions are starting to really collect and reshape what does history look like and what shows up in our museums and our different spaces by which we're telling a story. How are we collecting that information and then going to display it for future generations? We have to acknowledge that we are in different times, and we have to know that we cannot ignore the inequities. Thinking about in this idea of wanting to get back to business as usual, again, puts it back into the place of where we have the potential and the propensity to forget what was just going on, because now the anxiety, the frustration, the concern that we may have had is reduced. And as we reduce and go back into a space of feeling more comfortable, because right now we're in a space of feeling a lot of discomfort. But as we push and move into spaces where now we're going to be, uncomfortable for a little bit, our reaction as humans is to get out of that space and to get back into what makes us feel good. The issue with getting back into what makes us feel good is that if those were spaces that allowed for us to be unconscious to the inequities that were taking place around us, we go back to doing what feels really good to us, and we continue to perpetuate the inequities that were already in place and are going to be and have been exasperated because of this pandemic. And so the encouragement at this point is to really be able to grow out of the pain and the discomfort that we're feeling right now. The work that I do in equity, we talk a lot about this idea of without pain, there is no growth. And I always liken it to this idea of weight loss, that when people are trying to lose weight, if I start and I say, I'm going to be exercising and I'm going to exercise every single day, and I start by getting on the treadmill and running really, really hard, and then all of a sudden I get a cramp in my thigh and I'm like, ooh, I'm done, I'm done. If you stop at that point, the odds of you continuing on a lifestyle that's going to be more healthy by including exercise is limited, and it might actually come to a total stop because you experience pain and it didn't feel good and you just stopped. Whereas if I'm experiencing some pain if I figure out, okay, maybe I need to massage it a little bit, here's some things that I can do to kind of help me in this process. When you start doing those things, you keep going through it. And that initial pain that you felt starts to subside, and then you get to move and keep going. And now you're going to try something a little bit more difficult the next time. And as you persist through that, in that persistence, you're able to keep going. And so this idea is not to set aside the feelings of discomfort, to set aside the feelings of pain or grief that you might actually be feeling, but it's to understand, how do we grow and learn from this, and grow and learn in a way that actually goes about addressing inequities. Next slide, please. We have to realize that the way that we see things, the way that we experience things, is always through our beliefs, our values, and our beliefs. Lisa Delpit says we do not really see through our eyes or hear through our ears, but through our beliefs. And so it's recognizing that people that we might have uh, not been so kind to in the way that we thought about people who might be utilizing resources and public services, we might look at that differently now, because our experience is in need of having those different services. And so how do we understand and learn through our own experience as a way to be able to see and address inequities that are in front of us? When we don't have experiences that are aligned with experiences that other people might be having that leads to inequities, it makes it very difficult for us to see or address, or to try to go after uh, uh, doing something about the inequities, right? Pushing towards equity in the spaces. And so I want you to keep in mind that even though you can say we can both look at the same thing at the same time, the way that we interpret it is always going to be through our beliefs, through our experiences, and through our values. And so how do you help to get more information to you, help to have different perspectives that can sit side by side with you, to help you to see and to understand things that you may not have been able to see or experience before? Next slide. I think we're at a point of having a chat. If you want to talk about or ask questions around students who have been thriving during distance learning so far, and who's been struggling.
Right on, Makari. I thought this would be a good chance for you to have a sip of water.
Thank you.
Yeah. All right. So I just put something in chat. If you don't mind jumping on chat and responding to this question, who's been thriving during distance learning? Who's been just surviving? And who haven't you heard from so far? And as those come in, we will go forward.
And as you're thinking about who's been thriving and who has not, I want to really press us to think about who and what education was created and built for, and even how we see um, the non-engagement of our students and families. Are we seeing that in a way that's like, ooh, like I wonder what's going on, meaning in an empathetic and sympathetic way? Or are we seeing it with judgment? They just don't care about education. They just don't want to do this. And that also becomes part of understanding how our values and beliefs play out. This diagram is meant to kind of give some ideas, I shouldn't say ideas, to give a visual around how our values and beliefs work. And it starts with it starts with experiences, it starts with images that we see or don't see, and I have to say experiences that we have or we don't have, people that we engage with, meaning family and friends, who's not part of that family and friend network, and the education and or miseducation that we receive, right? All of these things play a role into building out our understanding, which is our values and beliefs, what we believe, how we place judgment, how we determine who's right and who's wrong, how we determine what's the right way versus what's the wrong way, where we give people grace and where we give people uh, you know, I'm going to say damnation. That's not quite the word I want to use, but where we're pushing on people in the sense of like they could do better. Those are our experiences or lack thereof, the images that we see or we don't see, the people that we engage with or don't engage with, the education that we get or we don't get. All of that fulfills and fills in our understanding of values and beliefs. And then with that, it leads into the fact of whether we're going to take action towards something or whether we don't take action towards something. And that action doesn't necessarily have to be a positive thing. We might take action in a negative way that, again, builds right back around to our experiences, our images, the people, and the education that we get or don't get. And it's just this rotating thing of understanding a few things, that our values and beliefs can change, right? It doesn't have to be stagnant. And it can be it can be molded and shifted and changed over time based on experiences that we get. If you think about travel as being being an experience, traveling, whether it's within the United States or outside of it, really can add depth to shifting how your values and beliefs are framed out. Meaning that if I have the opportunity to travel, my understanding about a global perspective is very different for those who don't travel. And so that builds out a different piece of my values and beliefs as a person who travels versus those folks that don't travel. And it leads to my understanding of action or inaction as a result of that. And then we keep rotating through. And so being aware of how that plays out is really important. Jeff, I saw something that said to respond um, to the questions. Do I need to respond to anyone?
No, not yet, Makari. I
Okay.
think, I mean, there's just a really interesting dialogue happening in here. And
Okay.
I just made a note to everyone. You can respond either to all panelists or all attendees. I think it's a little bit of a richer conversation if people just open up their comments and responses to all attendees. But
Okay, awesome.
that was the only note I wanted to make.
Okay. So keep in mind as you're thinking about how you're viewing those who are connecting and those who aren't connecting, and where and how you're placing judgment on that. And an example would be there. Oftentimes, when we think of distance learning, we limit it to technology, right? Are we able to connect online? But distance learning is inclusive of online learning, but it's not exclusive to online learning, meaning that there's other ways and modalities that we have to consider. How do we engage with students and families if they are unable to engage in the ways that we feel are the most convenient? So for example, all of us being able to get onto a Zoom and talk and to chat it out, that's something that works for us in this situation because we have access. For those folks that don't have access, for lots of reasons, the question becomes, what are other ways by which we will look to engage? And there are other ways to do that. So it's really thinking about when you're thinking about who's engaging and who's not engaging, where are you offering a mindset that is around where is the empathy, the sympathy, the understanding that I'm putting into place versus where am I creating judgment that is really negative, that they must not believe in, or they must not want, or they must not whatever. When we think about specifically those families, and I have to hurry up, those families that are participating as essential workers. And when I say essential workers, that's inclusive of our bus drivers, the folks that's picking up the trash, folks that are in grocery stores, folks that are at our restaurants and cooking food on our behalf. Those are essential workers, and that workforce is typically disproportionately people of color. As a result of that, if I have to keep going into work on a daily basis, and if the mode of connecting electronically is through my cell phone, and I have to take my cell phone with me, my children may not be able to connect. And so how are we thinking about what's happening for our students around us? Next slide. I want to just bring this forward, and this comes from Doug's book, Building an Equity Framework. This is a diagram that he used that shows the intersections of our different identities. And it's important for us to understand how our identities actually also help in our creation and our understanding, our formation, our sustainment of our values and our beliefs. And so where we sit in this, whether it's around gender identity, our faith, our education, those things help to shape how we see and understand the world around us. It's also recognizing that within these different intersections, some of these identities can change, right? The way that I see my sexual orientation could change over time. My family structure could change over time. And there's other pieces of our identity that are stagnant, right? Race and ethnicity are going to be things that don't change over time. It is what you have been identified as. But your age is going to change over time. And the way that you thought when you were 21 is going to be really different than how you think at 61. And so thinking about how that influences and impacts who you are, how you show up, how you respond, how you think about things, these are all impacting how your values and beliefs frame out, as well as your bias. And so values and beliefs also build into how you understand or how you don't understand the world, how you make those judgments, how that are negative, or how you're making positive judgments. And so this is to kind of help keep in mind the various intersections of who you are through identity and how that plays out consistently in how you are engaging or not engaging. Next slide. I just want to end out with really pushing forward this idea of understanding our biases. You have a responsibility to catch and reject deficit thinking and perspectives. And so that comes into play when I'm talking about this idea of when you are dealing with kids and families who haven't connected, where do you go, right? Where do you go? And if it's a place of a deficit thinking or deficit perspective, you're going to want to reject that, catch it, and then reject it. You need to be conscious of how your experiences influence the way that you see and interpret the behaviors and ways of being that's different from your own. What's different doesn't make it wrong, it makes it different. Recognize your unexplored assumptions. And that idea of unexplored assumptions means if I don't have access or experience to, it can lead me to simply make blanket statements and beliefs around a group of people, around students, around lots of different things. And so how do you catch and reject those things? The last is recognizing the habit to default into behaviors, beliefs, and practices that are comfortable to us. And just because it's comfortable to me and it's known to me does not mean that it's the right thing for the students and the families that I work with. Thank you.
Oh, Makari, thank you so much. I don't know, you probably didn't have a chance to glance through the chat, but maybe you'll have a minute to open it now and scroll back. There's a lot of interesting things that turned up there. And as we transition, I just want to ask that question as we're thinking about bias and what you left us with, Makari. I just want to invite people to add into chat kind of the next question, shifting our thinking. How might bias show up in a distance learning plan or in a distance learning classroom, as it were, right now? So what are your thoughts on that? Where might we see some of this bias show up? And as I do that, I'm going to transition to Lee Her, who is another one of my colleagues at the Department of Education. Lee, I think your mic is live. Go ahead.
All right. Good morning or early afternoon, everyone. And thank you for being here with us today. Again, my name is Lee Her, and I'm the Community Engagement Specialist in the Equity and Opportunity Division here at MDE. So I get to work collaboratively with community-based organizations, schools, and districts, and directly with families and communities, where my focus is on ensuring that our immigrant and refugee experience communities have what they need to fully participate in their children's education. I understand that this is a very loaded statement, but what my job generally involves is working with community leaders, working with family advocates and cultural liaisons in schools and districts to serve children from refugee communities, coordinating with our state agency partners like the Minnesota Department of Human Services Office of Refugee Resettlement to maintain a continuum of supportive services, and advocating for and promoting policies such as language access inside MDE and as well as inside districts to ensure that we minimize language as a barrier for our limited and English speaking communities. And so one way that community engagement supports the premise that we must recognize and reject the presence of biases or the values and beliefs that Makari spoke about is that if and when they begin to justify and perpetuate discriminatory or exclusionary policies, that is the point at which we are concerned about today, right? And community engagement works to address that because one of the things it focuses on is building compassion and empathy for others who we perceive to be different from us. Because let's be clear, bias is everywhere. We can't run from it. It's in our nature to apply knowledge that we have actively created and been exposed to since birth. Where it becomes an unnatural phenomenon is when one group's biases and beliefs determine the quality of life for everyone else. Again, it's at this point that this conversation we're having today becomes absolutely critical. And I believe that having compassion for one another is the direct result of understanding each other's lived experiences and how those experiences have shaped who we are today, our hopes and dreams for the future, and the kind of world that we want to live in. So what I've prepared for all of you today is a very brief analysis of how community engagement confronts inequity. And I'm going to do that with a very brief timeline about what inspired the department to establish its own family and community engagement initiative, followed by why racial equity is at the heart of everything we do and believe in at MDE. And then most importantly, as a result of our community engagement efforts, what we've learned about what inequity looks like in the day-to-day lives of our immigrant and refugee communities as they navigate distance learning and this whole COVID-19 pandemic. So with that, Jeff will go to the next slide. So I'm very fortunate to have a job that is directly informed by not just my intellectual understanding of racial equity, but also a very personal one and appreciation for it because of my lived experiences as a daughter of refugee parents and a product of the public school system that often, couldn't adequately support me as a student who struggled to navigate the world that my parents knew as Hmong and the world that I had come to know as a child growing up in America. So as you can see on this slide, the Every Student Succeeds Act, also known as ESSA, guarantees critical protections for our historically marginalized children and their families, making ESSA one of our country's most comprehensive civil rights law. And as the State Department of Education, MDE has a statutory responsibility to implement and monitor compliance around ESSA to report to the Minnesota legislature and the U.S. Department of Education. Now, very quickly, ESSA is the latest iteration of the original education policy, the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, which was signed into law by President Lyndon B. Johnson in 1965 as part of his nationwide war against poverty that, again, guarantees access to quality education for our country's historically marginalized communities. In 2002, it was reauthorized by President George W. Bush and became known as the No Child Left Behind Act. And then in 2015, it was reauthorized again by Barack Obama and became the Every Student Succeeds Act. Again, this law authorizes fiscal funding streams and compliance oversight to public institutions throughout the United States. And we'll go to the next slide, Jeff. So MDE's community engagement initiative was the direct result of ESSA, and then as well as Minnesota's Learning English for Academic Proficiency and Success Act, also known as LEAPS. So under No Child Left Behind, as you can see in the slide, schools and districts were only required to conduct student and family engagement. And then under ESSA, community engagement was added to that list of essential stakeholder groups. And then we're lucky that we live in a state with a legislation like the LEAPS Act, which added more robust recommendations and requirements around community engagement that focused on improving home language and English language acquisition programs and services for our English learners. Next slide. But to be clear, I am not a compliance monitor. I consider my work more along the lines of grassroots level community engagement. That's about uplifting voices and the lived experiences of families and communities that have been historically underserved by our educational institutions. I believe it's my job to inform, to advocate for, and to empower those communities to be part of the process that can bring about the kind of change we need to ensure that every child has what they need to succeed. So when I work with schools and districts, I make sure they understand that when we talk about community engagement, it's not just about what they did with communities within a 10-mile radius of their physical location, or that they sent translated letters home to non-English speaking parents, or that they did a family night at school, right? ESSA requests that schools and districts be intentional about how they will address and resolve long-standing racial disparities. And this means that one of the things they should be doing is working intentionally and collaboratively with our communities of color and Indigenous communities. Next slide. So now I hope you have a better understanding of the policy mandates and inspiration behind our stakeholder engagement work with immigrant and refugee experienced communities. So this is kind of a list of the targeted communities that I generally focus on. And that includes our Asian American communities, the Somali American community, the Latino American community, and our African diaspora communities, many of whom were refugees prior to resettlement in the US. The Somali community's primary language is Somali, the Latino community's primary language is Spanish, and the Asian communities speak over 40 different primary languages. Because we have Asian Americans, immigrant and refugees here from over 40 plus nations around the world. Most of these families entered the country as refugees, and most, if not all, the adults have little to no formal educational experience prior to resettlement. And according to the 2010 US Census survey, these are Minnesota's largest immigrant and refugee communities. And we all know that these communities are exceptionally linguistically and culturally diverse, but for the same reasons, their children struggle to fit in and to succeed academically because their lived experiences remain more or less invisible. And this pandemic that we're living through and distance learning have once again reminded us how difficult change is if we don't understand or know the lived experiences and current reality of our most vulnerable children and their families. And then we'll go to my last slide. So here, I've prepared a slide that sums up what we've learned about the barriers and the circumstances surrounding those barriers that our immigrant refugee communities are struggling with during distance learning. Based on conversations with families, students, and community members, the three issues that rose to the top are the three that you see in the circle diagram there. So for one, misalignment between what teachers and administrators know about refugee communities and distance learning plans that they design for their students. And what I mean by misalignment is that there were clear gaps between the knowledge that we know teachers and administrators have about the families they serve and some of the major components of the learning plans that they then put together for their students. For example, we know that most immigrant refugee families have limited to no formal educational experience, yet the issues and concerns raised by some of our immigrant refugee families indicated that educators assumed parents could read and write in English, were able to work remotely, or perhaps have a typical 8 to 5 low labor intensity job where once they're home, they could easily transition from focusing on schoolwork with their children, or that parents can navigate websites and apps to create logins and usernames and passwords. And then we also know that many immigrant refugee families don't have stable housing, employment, or financial security. Yet distance learning plans indicated that those who designed them assumed that that students had adequate study space, had reliable internet access and capacity, and that they had the social emotional capacity to cope with this new reality, where due to social distancing requirements, the sudden loss of community was just something that was much too bare for many of our immigrant refugee students and their families. And then second, minimal and strained relationships that predate, as Makare says, predated distance learning and COVID-19. We have learned that in general, there is very minimal depth to the relationships between teachers, administrators, and their students, families, and their students' broader communities. And as we all know, superficial relationships don't generally lend themselves to a genuine understanding of a person's reality. And we're seeing now how important nuances are when it comes to how do we engage hard-to-reach families and communities. And then in addition, schools and districts have strained relationships with community organizations that serve those particular communities. An example of this is that districts have traditionally relied on teachers and community organizations as primary access points to parents and families. This is the traditional model of engagement, but we now know that in this increasingly diverse and rapidly changing environment, we have to change our strategies and tactics to reflect our own growing body of knowledge about the families and communities that we serve. And last but not least, inadequate language access has just made it extremely difficult, if not entirely impossible, for our parents who speak limited or no English to facilitate distance learning, even if they want to. And some of the features of this challenge are underdeveloped processes to assess language assistance effectiveness, lack of standardized staff training, and insufficient infrastructure to support translation, interpretation, and keeping up with the scale of need for services in different communities. And so with that, I will end my part and give all of you to ask questions, share your thoughts, concerns, objections, and then we'll transition over to Peng, who is one of our 3 guest speakers that we're very fortunate to have with us today. Thank you.
Before, as Peng joins us here, I just wanted to let everybody know we're going to be continuing this session in the Google Meet. Peng unfortunately has another appointment at noon, so she won't meet us there, which is why we're giving her the floor now to share specific actions. So we're transitioning to specific actions teachers can take right now. Peng, Amy, and Glenn will be leading this part. So Peng, if you can unmute and go ahead. Is Peng with us? All right. Peng, I'm not seeing you here, so we're going to take a quick pause while we try and find you. Maybe you're just in the general participants, and I'm going to go forward. Surprise, Amy. Here you go. Can you unmute and take us ahead?
Yeah, I'm unmuted, I think.
All right.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Well, my name is Amy Thusen. I am a technology integration coach at Austin High School in Southern Minnesota. Just kind of a little background on Austin. We're kind of a unique rural/urban district. We are in the middle of southeastern Minnesota, so we are in a rural area with many of our rural sensibilities and access. And then we are also an incredibly urban area in terms of our diversity and in terms of some of our local businesses. And so I think that really positions us uniquely to learn in a variety of ways in our district. Just kind of speaking to distance learning, I know this is maybe not something that it would be easy to do now. One of the things that I think we found most successful when we started this distance learning journey was continuing our focus on maintaining relationships with students. The first week of distance learning, our administrators asked teachers not to introduce new content, not to do assessments, and to focus the learning on learning about kids and where they were at that given point. Focus on finding out what kind of access they had, what kind of barriers they were going to have. Teachers communicating with other teachers about what they were learning about student needs. And then also any learning that occurred was all about either building background for what we were going to address in the fourth quarter or reviewing what we did do in the third quarter. We also maintained that attendance would be only taken once per week, and actually students only had to access their online portal one time in order to be counted, one time per class in order to be counted present for that entire week. And I felt like that set a really good stage for us in terms of making sure that no students were counted absent because of inability to access things on a regular basis when it came to our online environments. And so I think that was really important as well. But building those, yes, go ahead.
Oh, sorry, Amy. I was just going to say, it looks like we have Peng here now.
Yeah.
Go ahead and finish. You were going to say about relationships.
Well, I was just going to say that the teachers who have found the subsequent weeks successful in distance learning are the ones who really focus that first week on rebuilding relationships after being gone for a while. We had our spring break in there as well. So that was, as many schools did, that was kind of unique. But also letting students know what it was going to be like to distance learn. They didn't just launch right into the learning. They actually spent time week one saying, this is what it's going to look like. Here's how our Schoology page looks. Here's where you're going to find the learning. Earlier, I was attending a session. I think John Lita was talking about accessibility. And he talked about context and the importance of teachers giving learners their context. And I think that was important for your whole, like, not just the topic you might be talking about, but also the context for the learning experience. The teachers who really focused on that in week one have had a much better experience and have had much more involvement from all kinds of students than people who just try to dive into learning and catch up and try to get where they were last year.
Right on. Thank you so much, Amy.
Let's
for
have
that.
Peng.
Yeah. Thanks. And
I'll come back.
we'll bring you back. I think Peng can't join us in the meet, but you will be there. Is that
Yep.
right? Awesome. Thank you so much. All right, Peng, can you unmute yourself and join us?
Yes, I think I am.
All right.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, we got you. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I put together 3 basic ideas, action steps that educators can use to engage their students of colors and families. And so the first point is that by this point, we should have some kind of relationship with families. And if we don't, this is the time that we really need to reach out to them. And so one of the things that I often tell my colleagues is that we need better communication within our own stakeholders, so that we're not like making 10 phone calls from 10 different teachers out to our families. And so communication is just key to making sure that our families hear from the person who may most closely be associated with or have the best relationship with. And we've been noticing that there are some families who we have not been able to get a hold of because the numbers that we call from Google Hangout are long distance numbers. And we're realizing that, wait a minute, how come the counselor and a bunch of teachers called all last week, leaving a lot of messages, and there's nobody that is picking up the phone that is talking to them? Well, and then I use my personal cell phone numbers with parents. That's the easiest way for them to get a hold of me. I call them, the minute I call, they pick up, and we're able to resolve what is needed. And so helping parents realize that, that in this time period, we are going to be using numbers that might be foreign to them, that it is coming from the school. And so it's also important that we have updated phone numbers for each family as well. Usually in the fall, I ask all students to give me an updated phone numbers for their families so that I can call them in times of need like this. Also realizing that every family is different. The amount of time that we spend with one family may be different from another family. And so it's okay that some families need a lot more support from us, and to let families know that, you know what, we are there for them and how they can best reach us. The second point I want to make is we've had lots of, in my district, we have 4 office hours every day that students can come in, and we support them. And so far, a lot of teachers have said, oh my God, there's nobody coming. So far, within the 4 weeks, I've had 4 students come to office hours. And so I've thought, you know what is it that I need to do to engage my students in a different way? Because my students love to see, they love to see each other. They love to interact in class. So I ended up changing, using one of my office hours to do live sessions, bringing in guest speakers on topics of interest to students, to motivate them, to help them through this time period, to help them with career sessions, all sorts of topics. And so we've had 2 guest speakers the last 2 weeks, and we've brought in over 100 students the last week. So it's been a hit so far, and we're going to continue to do that. The third item is we just no longer can't teach the way we used to, and we need to be much more creative in what we do with students in the classroom. So individualizing instruction to meet the needs of the students with student-centered learning, making instruction relevant to who they are, how they learn, and where they want to go. And so the Bush Foundation has a Student-Centered Equity Summit that will be online. I believe I do have it also in the link there. Maybe Jeff can share it with the folks in the chat box. But that is something that I've been working with in the, going to the last 3-4 years to really center students learning around my students. And so take it one step at a time. It's not easy, and you do what you can. Thank you.
That's awesome. Almost forgot to unmute. Glenn, you have 1 minute to say hello and invite people to join us over in the Google Meet. Sorry to leave you with such short time, but I know that you and Amy can join us, and I really want
Absolutely.
a productive conversation over in the Google Meet. So before Sean, jumps in and cracks the whip and shuts us down, tell us who you are and what you want to talk about.
Yeah, so I'm Glenn Irvin, an instructional coach in the Sauk Rapids Rice School District. Specifically, I work in the high school. And Pang and Amy have done a fantastic job talking about actions that we can actually do right now as individuals. And a lot of the time, I think we as educators think that the systems are driving all of the the productive actions. We need the systems to do the work for us. But in this case, in Sauk Rapids, we are leveraging that teacher-student relationship to get constant real-time feedback about not only about access, but also about uh, mental health and emotional well-being, and of course schoolwork, of course, too, but in combination with that relationship that we are leveraging between the teacher and the students, and we do it with the advisory groups basically. Then we can reach out to our counselors and our social workers if we need to go ahead and basically then use everybody's efforts towards making this as not as productive as we can, but as productive is great, but also just to make it the best experience that we can for our students and in their families. Should I keep going, Jeff? Or are you gonna
Well,
cut me off?
I just had a note that Dave gave us 5 more minutes. So do you
Oh,
have
perfect. Yeah,
one
yeah.
more thing you want to add? And
I'll
then
keep going.
we'll
Yeah.
thank everyone and join people over in the Google Meet.
And one of the things that we also have done, and I think it's super important, and we can do that can do this part as individuals, that as individual teachers, is and systems, is we can reframe the issue of accessibility and device access and all of those things away from it being something that is the student or the family's fault, and therefore not getting the correct feedback from them, and flipping that and saying, no, it is our responsibility as educators and as the systems, as the school district, whatever it might be, to provide that access for you. So if you frame it in that way, and you get better, more honest feedback from your students and your families, and nobody feels like they're being a burden on you. And that happens too often. And it's unfortunate, but we have flipped that and really have gotten great feedback and been able to provide, for example, hotspots to families that needed them, be able to get access to our rural areas for those students that need those that type of access, and then devices, making sure, of course, that we have those to our students. So really, that can be done at any school, at any district. And I thought that was an important thing to go ahead and share. Keep going, Jeff?
Well, thanks so much. I think we better close it up here because
good.
there is the next session coming in. Sean, go ahead.
Hello, everybody. What a wonderful topic. Just so appreciative of the people. And so we were well aware that this is one of those topics that probably isn't going to be able to wrap up in 45 minutes. And so I am posting now a link to a Google Meet session to be able to continue this conversation. So if you click on that link, that will take you over to Google Meet that I will have to allow you access into. And then in addition to that, you can continue this conversation, feverishly looking for links, at the flip grids that are all posted. Links to all of those things are posted on the mndlsummit.org site. In addition to the links for the CEUs are available over there as well. So we are going to continue this conversation over in Google, and then we'll post everything else you need for this, including the archive sessions. This session has been recorded and will be available through archive as well. All of the sessions from Friday, the links to CEUs, everything that you need is going to be available on the Minnesota DL Summit.org site for you to stay connected and keep the conversation going. I'm admitting people. I'm over. You can't tell I'm over here because
Okay,
I'm
with that
just
being
sitting at
said,
one desk, but I'm letting people in.
So should I head over that way, Jeff?
Yeah, but it's that way. Sorry.
Right, that way. Okay.
Go that way. There you go. That's the
Okay.
my it's right over here on this screen over here. So yeah, that's right.
as the
All right, so
attendees are
I'm going to
fleeting.
disconnect from here, right, and head over there.
Yep, and for all attendees, this session will be closing out in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
Okay.
Just kidding. It's just